Amnesty International investigated some of the materials used on the smartphones that we're using on a daily basis, and they found that some of the minerals that are being utilized are mined by children in countries where they are not compensated properly, and they're also dealing with extremely unsafe work conditions. Now, Amnesty's investigation found that in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC, there are areas where children work in artisanal mines to feed the thriving market for cobalt, an ingredient in the lithium-ion batteries of modern smartphones. Now, when you see the word artisanal, it sounds fancy, and it's usually associated with positive things like artisanal food and sandwiches and pizzas, whatever. That's not what they mean by artisanal. This essentially means that these children, who are extremely young, are mining with their bare hands without the proper work materials to keep themselves safe. Some of them do get very ill, some of them do die, and they're not paid much, okay? When Amnesty International investigated this further, they found that children were digging by hand using rudimentary tools in sparsely regulated impromptu mines. But when Amnesty asked the question, does cobalt in the company's products originate in the DRC, Apple, Microsoft, Samsung, Sony, and HP were all unable to answer directly, with answers like unable to say and currently under evaluation. And for only $1 to $2 a day, children as young as 7 can work long days in tunnels dozens of meters below the ground with no gloves or other protective equipment. So that's what's going on. But my question is, A, do Americans really care? Right? And B, if Americans find out about what's going on with the technology that they rely on so much, are they willing to do anything to change it?
Well, there actually is a group called the Enough Project, which talks about what they call blood phones. I think you can figure out where the meaning got derived from when you look at this. And a lot of their work is working toward identifying which phones have metals sourced from conflict areas. There are ideas to colorize or otherwise make these metals look materially different if they came from Congo or another conflict area or a place where they are, being sourced from children.
So when you say they make them materially different, do they do that to hide the fact that they were mined in a questionable way?
They change the physical property to make it look like
Okay.
I can identify this as it came from Congo or some other place, because we have tech companies, and this has been going on for years.
Of course.
And some of them are more likely to say, oh, this is where we got it. Some, you may remember Nintendo famously was basically distanced themselves from the entire process of creation based on these metals. So they'd say, oh, we got them from our partners, it's their problem. That was a while back, though.
Right. Well, what seems to be happening here is the cobalt gets mined in, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And then that material goes to their parent company in China, and then it's utilized for the batteries for the smartphones. But here's the thing. We did, a story on this huge expose involving Apple and, the factories, yes, exactly, the factories in which these products are put together, and just how terrible the working conditions are, to the point where people are taking their own lives. Did that convince Apple to do anything? There were some changes within that factory, but not enough to actually warrant Apple working with them or Apple, and it's not just Apple. I know I'm picking on them for this story, but it's basically every major company that manufactures these phones. And they do it because they want to cut costs. If you outsource these jobs to countries like China and you use materials that have been gathered in conflict areas, well, you do cut costs, but you also, ruin lives, you take lives, and where do you draw a moral line?
These companies too, I want to point out that they're not above the law. There was a court case, I believe that it involved Nestle. They had employed children in the Ivory Coast harvesting cacao. They knew about it. They'd financially subsidized farmers. They knew these kids were working on these farms. And 2 of them grew up. They became plaintiffs in a case, and the court just ruled that these plaintiffs do have standing. They can go after companies. So this isn't without impunity. There will come a day where these kids, if they survive this and decide to go after companies that have used them for labor, that they do have standing, even if they're not U.S. citizens, which is what we saw in the case of Nestle. So that's the one caveat caveat to this that enough awareness is great, but at the same time, until these companies are forced to pay punitively, it really we don't ever see a change socially.
Of course. We have done story after story involving the unsafe working conditions in other countries and the high cost of that for Americans and for the people living abroad. Now, for Americans, in reality, there isn't a high cost. Like, we have cheap products in the U.S. precisely for that reason, that, you know, companies outsource these jobs to places that don't have the same types of regulations that America does or the United States does. And we get cheap products as a result of that. But how much are we willing to sacrifice, and how much are we willing to kind of turn the other way toward for cheap products?
I think a lot of it is up to, people need to push these companies to be more responsible, or at least cite where these things are coming from. I know a lot of clothing companies are now starting to move toward this trend, but it's not something we've really seen in technology. Until there is some amount of people saying, we won't buy this, which will unlikely happen unless you change, that's probably not going to change.
Yeah, and by the way, another thing, smartphones aren't cheap. Like, they're very, very expensive. And I'm very curious to see what would happen to the prices of these phones should they operate in a more moral way, right? I'm sure the cost will increase, and that would be a bummer. I feel like it's worth it. I don't want to see children as young as 7 mining with their bare hands for the materials to make these products.
I mean, when you see like mining like this, there needs to be some way of identifying these materials, putting a stop to use of these materials. I mean, it's just in illegal gold mining, for example, you know, you have children or adults doing this with their bare hands, releasing mercury onto their bodies, into the environment. It's not good at all in the long run. And we are thinking in sort of a short-sighted way.